Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I'm your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's jump right in and study some Jewish history together. So we left off last week on the cusp of the creation of the modern-day state of Israel. And we have to appreciate not only the serendipity of circumstances that had to line up just 100% right for the state to come into being, but the fact that it's continued to succeed. I mean, you just imagine, you know the old story about two Jews, three opinions. The way I like to tell it is when we talk about the Septuagint, which was the Targum Shivim, the translation of the Torah into Greek by 70 scholars, that the king Ptolemy put the 70 scholars in 70 different rooms because he wanted to make sure to get the exact translation, didn't want them to collaborate on changing anything, and they came up miraculously with the exact translation. And I always say that's not miraculous. You put 70 rabbis in 70 different rooms, you get the same translation. Put 70 rabbis in the same room and get them to agree on something, and that would be miraculous. So all these factors played into the founding of the state of Israel, and you know, they're really still playing out today. I mean, think about what just took place yesterday. The state of Israel had its fifth election in 4 years. You know, Baruch Hashem, thank God this time it was at least decisive with the Netanyahu/religious bloc looking like they're going to get 65 MKs, 65 members of Knesset. I believe, I tried to do some research on it today quickly, but I believe this will be the most religious government ever in the history of Israel, with about 35 seats, the majority of the coalition being the both Shas, the Gimel, the United Torah Judaism Party, and the Religious Zionist Party. So it could be very interesting times in Israel over these next few years. But again, you see just the fact that you know, you have so many different opinions amongst the Jews, and that all has to form a state, and that's what happens with the modern state of Israel. So we often focus on the struggles from the Arabs, the struggles from the Arab neighbors, and that sometimes forces us to lose sight of the actual struggles from within that had to go into founding the state. And we see it really right away in the discussions that were abound as far as the Declaration of Independence of the state, the naming of the state. All these things were subject to great debate, and there was no way a single monolithic voice in what any of these things should be. And what we see today was the result of much committee negotiation. For example, in the Declaration of the State, up until almost the last minute of preparing it for the state to be declared, there were many debates on what it should be said, and it's almost a benign document because it had to be in order to keep the different factions happy. Because amongst the founders, you had the rabbis, the religious parties that were involved, you had the secular parties that were involved, you had the communist parties that were involved. And one of the big debates, I mean, it's crazy to think about this, but one of the biggest debates in the Declaration of the Independence of the State of Israel was if they should mention God or not. I mean, it's a crazy thing to even mention, but it was a huge debate because you had the socialists who were going to be the majority that said we've been fighting for 100 years to get religion out of the Jewish people. Now we're going to put God into the Declaration of Independence, to which the religious faction obviously said this is the Jewish state and you're not going to mention God. So the compromise that came up with was that the Declaration of Independence should mention Sur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel. And for the religious, the Rock of Israel could mean God. For the secular, it could just mean the universe or whatever they would say, and that was the agreement. Now, the rabbis involved originally said at least called Sur V'Goalo, the Rock and the Redeemer of Israel, and that was actually supposed to be added in. Ben Gurion agreed to add that in, but somehow it was left out in the final draft, and it is not there. So, again, you see what's played out in modern times, it played out the same way 75 years ago, and every moment in between. One of the other big questions that was not settled until almost the last minute was what the name of the country should be. Now, we think, of course, it was Israel, right? No, that was hotly debated and contested amongst the founders of the state as to what the state should be called. And there were actually several candidates. Obviously, Israel was one of the main candidates, but beyond that, it was Eretz Yisrael. Actually, you know, what we do call it in Hebrew, but that should be the official name, Eretz Yisrael, not just Yisrael or Medinat Yisrael. Aver, Yehuda, Tzion. These were all suggestions. Tziona, Ivria, Herzliya, All suggestions. Now, early on, Yehuda and Zion, or Judah and Zion, were ruled out because in the original partition plan, Jerusalem and the area of Judea were not going to be part of the state. They were part of the Arab partition because Zion means Jerusalem, and Judah is Yehuda, is what we now call or what they call the West Bank, what we call Judea and Samaria. And so it wasn't originally supposed to be part of the country, so they felt that it wasn't right to call it Judah or Zion. Now, it's interesting that Judah, in certain ways, would have been the most logical name because that was the last name the country had before the destruction of the Second Temple. If we follow just the 30-second history here, at after Solomon reigned, we had the split of the kingdom. The kingdom splits into Yisrael and Yehuda. The king, the house of David's in Yehuda, and the breakaway is that, 10 out of 12 tribes was the country of Yisrael. The country of Yisrael is wiped out long before the country of Judah is wiped out. And therefore, when the Jews come back for the Second Commonwealth, they don't call it Yisrael. Yisrael was wiped out. They call it Yehuda. They call it Judah. And that's the name of the country during the whole Second Commonwealth. We know from the coins that the Romans minted after they destroyed Jerusalem. It's a Judea Capta, because the country was called Judah. It was called Yehuda. So that would have been a logical choice, but it was ruled out because really the tribal portion of Judah was not originally supposed to be part of the country. So it went back and forth, and it wasn't until the Declaration of Independence was actually read that people found out the name of the new country was going to be Yisrael, was going to be Israel. And it only passed by a vote of 6-3. It wasn't like it was unanimous. In fact, there's a fascinating one of my favorite books of really this time period is the book Prime Ministers by Yehuda Avner, Zichrono Livracha. Highly recommended book to everybody. It's a wonderfully documented history that reads like a novel. It's written so well and it's so fascinating. But in there, he writes that he was part of the siege of Jerusalem, or in siege in Jerusalem, as we'll talk about shortly, and how the word got out that the state had been declared. And the first question they asked is, what's it called? Because no one knew what it was going to be called. So, this is just all part of the sectarianism that goes on inside the Jewish people, and one of the again, I'm not a parliamentary expert here or a legal expert here, but the fact that Israel chose to follow the British parliamentary system leads from the occupational hazard of any parliamentary system, but especially we have such dissenting views that often people who are small in support and the numbers that elected them can yield tremendous power. And we saw this in it's almost the previous government in Israel, where you had Bennett, who was able to become the prime minister, even though he came from a party that only had 6 seats, 6 out of 120, the 6th or 7th larger, 8th contingency in the Knesset. But he made himself the kingmaker because he was really a right winger in theory. And, basically sold his soul to the devil to be able to become prime minister. And he says to Lapid that I'll join your coalition, but I get to be prime minister and I get to be prime minister first. And in order to make the coalition, they accepted, he becomes prime minister, and we all know what happens from there. By the time Lapid's turn comes, the dissolution of the Knesset had already been voted upon in the new elections, and now this hobbled together government will be no more. And we will have a Likud government, a Likud and religious government is what it's going to be. Half Likud and really about 30 members will be Likud and 35 will be from the religious parties. Again, I think this is a historic occasion that will have so much of a Torah influence in the country. Again, not to say that's monolithic either, because the religious Zionist party is very different from Gimel, which has its differences from Shas. So, but be it as it may, I think it's still a remarkable time for the modern state of Israel. Okay, so this is some of the internal struggles that didn't start after the state was founded. It started before the state was founded, and were being debated and discussed and dealt with while the war is really being fought. So May 15th, 1948, at 4 p.m., the state is declared. Now, that was a Friday afternoon, and the British mandate was due to expire at midnight that night. In other words, the British said, we're leaving at midnight. Ben Gurion had at least enough sensitivity to the religious parties within Israel to declare the state not at midnight, but before Shabbos, even though it was in May, so 4 o'clock was still long before Shabbos, and that way it would be declared to take effect at midnight when the British would leave. Now, as soon as the state's declared, war is declared upon Israel from all of its neighbors. Now, as we said last week, the war had really been going on for a year now, since November, or for almost a year, since 6 months now, since the partition plan, because there had been many cross settlement skirmishes between the Arabs and who became the Israelis, and the Jordanian army was already the Arab Legion, which is the Jordanian army, was already very present in the state of Israel, in the land of Israel, and therefore, even though until the state's declared, it's really just what we're going to call it, what's called oftentimes a civil war between the Jews and the Arabs living in the British Mandate. At the end of the British Mandate, it becomes an out-and-out war with Israel's neighbors, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, all declaring war on Israel. Now, the main belligerents are Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Lebanon came in, fought a few shots, and went home. Iraq sent a pretty significant amount of troops that were under the control of the Arab Legion, and Syria sent about several thousand troops that fought in the Golan Heights, but not too much success. Saudi Arabia and Yemen basically sent some token soldiers, and those are the belligerents and the Army for Independence. Now, 11 minutes after midnight, when the Declaration of Independence goes into effect, President Harry S. Truman of the United States is the first country to de facto recognize the state of Israel. And it's actually a great trivia question that the United States is number one, and who is number two? Many often think it was the Soviet Union, but that's not true. The second country to recognize the state of Israel was, interestingly enough, Iran. I mean, think about that with in the modern with our modern situation with the Iranians. But Iran was in a very interesting situation because this was before the Iranian Revolution, and even though Iran had voted against the partition plan, we're going to see from the founding of the state until the Iranian Revolution, there's actually pretty good relations between Iran and Israel. And unfortunately, when the Shah is overthrown, there goes that. We'll talk about that, in a subsequent session. But the United States is the first country to recognize Israel, Iran is the second country, and the Soviet Union becomes the first nation to fully recognize Israel in a legal sense on May 17th, 1948. The United States, as promised by Truman, waits to officially recognize the state until January 31st, 1949, after the first elections are held within Israel. That's when Truman recognizes Israel legally by an act of government. And the General Assembly of the United Nations in Resolution 2733 admits Israel to the United Nations on May 11th, 1949. Often an event I think Israel has questioned and has wanted to take back and erase from history. But be it as it may, that's a lot of the world recognition of the State of Israel. It all basically comes right away from the majority of the world, with the exception of the Arab countries and Great Britain. Now, when the British left on May 15th leading into May 16th, they left a total mess, as we talked about before, and their hope was that the Jews would get so bloodied, battered, and beat up by the Arabs that they would beg for the British to come back as the savior, and that would be the end of anything, and the Jews would remain just a small yishuv living in this area controlled by the British. But that's not what happened. The British leave a huge mess, the Arabs invade, and it was really a petrifying event for the Jews of the world, because here, just 3 years after the Holocaust, there was like a threat of another Holocaust in the land of Israel, because that's what the Arab countries were threatening. They told the UN they felt it necessary to go in to restore the law and order and stop the bloodshed, but really their proclamations were they were going to destroy the Jewish presence in the land of Israel. Now, we're going to talk about this, I'm going to remind you this several times in the next few sessions. It's not that the Arabs wanted to liberate the Palestinians so a Palestinian state could be formed, as that they wanted to get the Jews out of there so Abdullah, the King Abdullah of Jordan, could control the West Bank, and King Farouk of Egypt could control Gaza and the western side of the country, and that they could basically absorb the different parts of Palestine into their empires. That's what they wanted to happen, because as we're going to see, the Arabs really didn't get along at all themselves. They didn't coordinate their efforts. They didn't work together. Had they, it might, again, have been a different result, but thank God they didn't. Now, these young Israelis, this young country fought with a lot of chutzpah. They fought with the help of Jews from across the world. Jewish servicemen, American Jewish servicemen flew over to help the Israelis to join the Israeli army. Jewish businessmen sent weapons. Many sat in jail because of that. Money was sent from across the Jewish world. It became a true Jewish cause to help the fledgling state of Israel to survive. And they had so little manpower at first. Their Air Force initially consisted of 2 Piper Cubs with a few German Messerschmitts. They had maybe 30,000 that mobilized initially. Now that 30,000 is going to go up to over 100,000, but initially it's about 30,000. And what's going to happen is every single citizen is going to be mobilized eventually. It's going to be at that moment. The 35,000 are essentially the paramilitaries that existed before the IDF, and we're going to see that mandatory conscription is going to start pretty quickly. Now they're going against Arab armies that could have numbered in the hundreds of, in the hundreds of thousands. In well over 100,000. But the numbers were definitely in the beginning completely stacked against the Jews. But beyond numbers, and every other metric possible, the Jews were outnumbered. They had maybe 6 tanks in total that were either stolen from the British or parts were stolen from the British and they were reassembled. There were 2 tanks that they got from 2 British soldiers who were loyal to the Israeli cause, who defected and brought the tanks with them. And okay, so tiny Air Force, tiny artillery, tiny tank battalion against the Arab Legion and the Egyptian army, which were 2 massive military powers. And while the civil war, the Palestinians who became known as the Palestinians, the Arabs living within Israel, already realized that they were outnumbered, outflanked, and outspirited by the Israelis, by the Jews. Once the help came from the Arab League, from the Arabs from outside, the Arabs within Israel felt that now they had their backup, they had their win. And the Arab League told the Arabs living within Israel, they basically said, get out of the way. We're gonna wipe this area free of the Jews. Just stay back, get out of the way, and after we're done getting rid of all these Jews, you can go and have everything that was there in all of yours. We'll clear the country for you people. And that's what happened with many of the Palestinians. Yes, there were some Palestinian. We had to be intellectually honest on this. There were definitely Palestinian areas and Palestinian villages where there was forced evacuation, or the evacuation was encouraged by the Jews. But really, the sentiment that was given to the Palestinians, they were sold a bag of tricks that this is going to be quick and easy. We're going to get rid of the Jews, and then you can have the whole country. And as we all know, that's not how it plays out. Now, right after the Declaration of Independence, we have Egypt, who comes into the country in 2 waves. They have one wave that goes up the coast towards Tel Aviv, and they have another wave that goes to Jerusalem. Now, they expected to be able to take over these Jewish settlements in a matter of a few hours, and each one was days, sometimes weeks. They totally underestimated the resolve of the Jews who were fighting, and many times the Jews were fighting with homemade Molotov cocktails and all kinds of homemade munitions, but totally underestimated by the Egyptians. Now, the Egyptians were partially helped out by their completely corrupt king, King Farouk, who will go down in history as one of the most corrupt world leaders of all time. When he's overthrown in Egypt and he flees first to France and then to Rome, they find in his wake, in his tracks, the world's largest pornography collection. He, as many Arab leaders, or many leaders, we don't have to say Arab leaders, had many extramarital affairs, and but beyond his corruption went also in the area of arms trades, because much of this mighty military Egyptian army much of their munitions and their weapons and their tanks and whatnot just didn't work. 1 in 3 Egyptian rifles didn't shoot. The bullets were faulty, and therefore, what happens is the Egyptians going to war against the Israelis really exposes the corruption of King Farouk and brings his downfall. So, as often happens in world history, the last stand that a world leader makes is when he decides to go against the Jewish people, because it brings his downfall. And that is for sure what happens with King Farouk and the Egyptian monarchy, which had lasted from roughly the year 1800 and will come to an end here. Farouk will abdicate, will flee. Officially, his son, who is about 6 months old, will be considered king, but obviously he's going to flee with his father, and this is the end of, and it'll lead to the end of the Egyptian monarchy. But the Egyptians do come within 5 miles of Jerusalem, but are stopped there. And as they come through Gaza to head towards Tel Aviv, they get close to Tel Aviv and they're stopped there. Had the Egyptians managed to conquer Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the whole war would have been over. But again, that's not what happened. It's not what happened at all, because they just totally underestimated the resolve of the Jews, and they really didn't follow the old war tactic of Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy, who, when he was outnumbered, outflanked, and out everything by the Union armies, he had a military strategy of going around the strongholds, of not trying to attack the strongholds, but going around the strongholds. And the Egyptians did the exact opposite. They always went directly for the strongholds, and we're going to see, because of that, about a month into the army, they just get completely worn out, burnt out. We have what's called the Fallujah Pocket, where it was kind of a situation where the Israelis encircled the Egyptians encircled the Israelis, but psychologically, the Israelis made the Egyptians feel that they were the ones that were encircled. And that's known as the Fallujah Pocket. And now even though the Egyptians did terrible, really terrible, based on what should have been their strength in the war, the one army that was that had some success was the Jordanian army, because it becomes in many places in the war a stalemate between the Jews and the Jordanians. And the Jordanians are in the old city of Jerusalem, and they're in what becomes known as the West Bank, or what we call Judea and Samaria, and it basically becomes almost the entire war is a stalemate between the Jordanians and the Jews. To which point, at the end of the war, the Jordanians are going to be left in control of Jerusalem and the Judea and Samaria area, and they will annex that as part of Jordan. Now, by the way, from 1948 to 1967, the West Bank, Jerusalem, is annexed to Jordan. It's considered part of Jordan. It's annexed within the first year after the War of Independence, and no one cares about that, right? And by the way, the Jordanians and the Palestinians are no close friends, right? But no one cares about the fact that the Jordanians stole this Palestinian land and made it their own country. But for some reason, after 67, when we get it not from the Palestinians but from the Jordanians, that's not okay. But it was okay when the Jordanians did it, but it's not okay when the Jews do it. Go figure that one. Now, one of the things that the Jordanians did during the war is they had a complete siege on Jerusalem. They closed the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and it was really a dire situation for the Jews living within Jerusalem during the war, until the Israelis discover what they call the Burma Road, named after the famous Burma Road from World War II, which was an old mule path or animal path that was able to circumvent the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and like that, through that road, which the Jews basically dig out and don't quite pave, but make that it can be traversed by working on it at night. They're able to break the siege of Jerusalem, but it's not enough to get the Jordanians out of Jerusalem. And therefore, the Jordanians are going to be left in control of Jerusalem after the War of Independence. Now, up in the north, the Syrians come into the country in the Galil and the Golan Heights, and the main battle takes place in what's known as Emek HaMayanot, the Valley of Springs, Beit Shan, that area up towards the north on the Israeli-Syrian border. By the way, it's a very special place for us here in Cleveland, because through the federation system, Beit Shan and Emek HaMayanot are the sister cities. The sister city of Cleveland. But that's where the War of Independence takes place with the Syrians. And the Syrians are basically stopped the whole time. The Syrians can't, it's a bloody battle up there, but the Syrians at no point are able to penetrate. And what all this will result in is the Jews at this point in the war will conquer the full Galil, the Galilee, will conquer the Golan Heights, most of the Golan Heights, will conquer the parts surrounding the Judea and Samaria, and the country will end up double the size of what it was supposed to be at the time of partition. Now, one of the Arab strongholds during the War of Independence was the city of Tzfas. Now, Tzfas, for all of you who've been there, is one of the high points of the country. I don't know if it's the highest point. I think Hermon, which wasn't even part of the country yet, but is now the highest point. But at this point, I think Tzfas is probably up there as the highest point in the country. And it was controlled by the Arabs. There was a small Jewish population there and a large Arab population. And they tell the story that the commander in Tzfas was Yitzchak Rabin, I believe. And someone once asked Yitzchak Rabin what his strategy was to defend Tzfas against the Arabs. And he said, oh, well, it's very simple. These angels are going to come down from heaven with fiery swords and beat our Arab enemies. And the person said, do you really believe that? He said, no, but there's a greater chance of that happening than my soldiers actually defending this mountain. And they were so outnumbered. But, the Jews really used a lot of psychological warfare throughout the war. And they used one of their, I guess we'll call it their secret weapons called the Davidka. Now, the Davidka is basically a big grogger. It was an artillery piece that made a huge amount of noise and didn't do much damage. But the Jews one day invoked the use of the Davidka on Tzfas. And the sound is tremendous. And the legend goes that there was a Arab woman who asked an Israeli woman, a Jewish woman, what is that sound? To which the Jewish woman responded, it's an atomic bomb. So the Arabs thought that the Jews were dropping an atomic bomb on the mountain, and the Almighty, with his divine sense of humor, decided to help out with the situation and made it rain. Which, as many of us know, when it rains in May in Israel, that's an unfounded thing. But that's what happened on that night. So between the sound of the Davidka and the psychological warfare and the rain, the Arabs completely abandoned the mountain of Tzfas. And the Jews were able to take control of Tzfas, take control of Tveria down in the valley, and like that, were able to take control of the Galil. Now, by the end of June, the Arabs run out of steam, and the UN did what they always do when it looks like the Arabs are running out of steam. They call for a ceasefire. Right? That's what always happens. The Jews are starting to win. Oh, let's call a ceasefire. When the Arabs are winning, oh, no, ceasefire. The Jews are winning, call a ceasefire. That's what happens here. But then again, truth be told, that in this war, we really needed the ceasefire as much as they did, because we had run out of all our ammunitions. We had nothing left. And officially during the ceasefire, there is an arms embargo. No one's supposed to sell arms or give arms to either side, but neither side recognizes that part of the ceasefire, and both sides try and rearm and strengthen their positions during this period of the ceasefire. And just moments before the night before the ceasefire, the Irgun, that at this point that was the part of the army controlled by Menachem Begin, the Irgun tried to conquer Jerusalem. They blew up Zion Gate. There were 150 soldiers, but unfortunately they were all cut down brutally by the Jordanians. Now, at this point, the United Nations appoints a mediator whose goal is to go in and mediate between the Jews and the Arabs, and the Lehi assassinates him during this period of the truce. Now, there's and by the way, it's a 30-day ceasefire at this point, and there's another very famous or infamous event that takes place during this time period, and it's the Altalena situation. The Altalena is a ship that was commissioned by Menachem Begin to deliver arms from France to Tel Aviv to the Irgun, to Menachem Begin's paramilitary group before the war. Now, Begin didn't, knowing that the state was going to be declared, and working on an agreement with Ben Gurion that the Irgun should be folded into the Israeli Defense Force, he had actually sent a message for the ship not to set sail, to stay in France and stay put. Now the message did not get to France, and the ship set sail anyways. And again, this is before a lot of modern communication, and they had to be under the radar. But the ship contained $25 million in arms and 1,000 fighters. And it went on anyways. And when it arrives during the ceasefire period, Ben Gurion insisted that the Altalena be turned over to the IDF. By the way, it set sail on June 11th and arrived during the ceasefire period. So he demanded that everything be turned over to the IDF. Menachem Begin said it should at least go to the Irgun division of the IDF. Now, Begin did not agree with that either, because he didn't want to give the impression or promote the idea of an army within an army. So it led to a skirmish between Begin and Ben Gurion, and eventually when the ship landed on June 20th, the IDF resisted its arrival, and eventually they shelled the ship, and the ship was sunk, and in the ordeal, it was a terrible situation where 16 Irgun members, 3 IDF members were killed. Now Begin, at the time, told his whole faction that you're going to stand down, not to respond, not to fight back, and through that, he really worked to mend the rift that led to the whole situation. But it's crazy to think about, during the short ceasefire period, that a civil war almost broke out in the country that wasn't even a month old, and that's Jews for you. But when the second round begins, and later in June, it's clear the Israelis have the upper hand. They go into complete offensive, and they really expand past the partition at this point. They even go into the Sinai. And again, the only ones who are not defeated are the Jordanians. Now here, the British send a message to the Israelis that if they don't stop pushing Egypt, that they're going to intervene. Because the British needed Egypt to not fall because of the Suez Canal and other installments and interests they had in Egypt. So it's actually recorded that on the last day of the war, that the IDF shot down 3 British planes over the Sinai, that the British were ready to intervene if the Israelis didn't stand down. And that's what happens towards the end of the war. Now, the war really begins the Arab refugee problem as we know it. Again, because as we said, the Arabs told their brethren living in the land of Israel, get out of the way, and then you'll have the whole country. And they got out of the whole way, but they were never given the country back. And they were always treated terribly by their Arabs. They were put in refugee camps set up by Jordan. And it's really been the United Nations supporting them ever since. Now, after the final end of the 3 rounds of the war, the UN sends another mediator in, and a man named Ralph Bunche, and they have the mediations, the negotiations take place in Rhodes, and the Israelis negotiate armistice with each and every single one of the Arab leaders individually, and really the belief of the Israelis is that these armistices would lead to peace agreements, and that this would be the end of it. But the Arabs never respected the armistice. The most notable is the Jordanians, who as part of the armistice agreed to grant free passage of the Jews to religious sites in Jerusalem, to the Kotel, to the Mountain of Olives, and that was never ever honored. From 48 to 67, Jews are not allowed to pray at the Kotel, and not allowed on the Mountain of Olives. And that's the situation. And again, no one sneezes at this. No one cares that the Jordanians don't respect the armistice. No one cares that the Jordanians annex part of Israel, and no one worries about the poor Palestinians at that point. Now, besides now beyond with the Jordanians and their not respecting the armistice, they also, with their total sensitivity to history and to the culture of the land, they blew up and destroyed 42 synagogues in Jerusalem after the War of Independence. The famous Chorva Shul was destroyed for a second time, the Ramban Shul. All the 42 synagogues in the old city of Jerusalem are destroyed by the Jordanians. Now, that's in contrast to in 67, where we take control of Jerusalem and we leave the Mosque of Omar, we leave the Al-Aqsa Mosque, we leave the Temple Mount alone. We even give them basically free reign on the Temple Mount. And we're considered the aggressors and the bad guys here. But anyhow, I know I'm preaching to the choir on this one. But the whole war ended up, in general, even though the Jordanians had a certain amount of success, the war is referred to as the Nakba, the great catastrophe in the Arab world, and it's a disgrace for the Arab world. And so much of the conflict between the Jews and the Arabs is the fact that in Arab culture, once you're disgraced, you don't let that go too easily. So when eventually we're going to see the Egyptians are going to make peace with the Israelis, it's going to be amazing, because that's and Sadat will pay for that with his life. But it's going to be going against this tremendous Arab emphasis on honor and all that. So the war is a bloody war for the Israelis. About 1% of the population is dead. You put that in terms of America today, that'd be 3.3 million people. And unfortunately, from that point on, it seems like the Arabs have really won the war narrative, won the cultural narrative. The sympathy that led to the state is really over after the war, and then that bias against the Jews really starts at this point. It goes on until modern times, of the fact that we were the ones who kicked the Palestinians out of their homes. We were the ones who put them in refugee camps. We thought after 1948 there was going to be peace and it would all be worked out. And by the way, one of the reasons is interesting, back when they were debating the name of the country, they were debating what to call the country for the Palestinians, what it should be called in Arabic. Now, they thought that there would be a Palestinian state started, so they weren't going to refer to it as Palestine in Arabic because they thought there would be a state Palestine right next to them. But none of that ever happens because, as Abba Eben's famous line goes, the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and they've just been missing opportunity after opportunity from before 1948. You know, be a great shirt, you know, like the Arabs, missing opportunities since 1948 because they're not going to take the armistice peace agreements, and they're just going to stay in a state of war until well after the Yom Kippur War, when finally we'll see that start to break a little bit with first Egypt, then in the 90s with Jordan, and then really nothing happened again until 2020, where we saw the Abraham Accords lead to finally another break in the Arab League's position of not recognizing Israel. And God willing, it will continue. God willing, it will continue. We'll see more and more peace deals, and it should really just be a harbinger to the days of Mashiach Tzidkenu, when we'll see the true redemption of the Jewish people, the true redemption of Israel, with Mashiach on the throne, ruling the country in the way that Hashem intended. We should see it b'mehera v'yameinu. And I thank you for joining us tonight. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to discussing more Jewish history with you next week. Have a wonderful week.